In today's episode of Plants of the Gods, join host Dr. Mark Plotkin in conversation with colleague Dr. Bruce Hoffman, Senior Manager of Scientific Research at ACT, as we learn about the ethnobotany of the Amazonian lianas. Dr. Hoffman is the author of the classic work, The Lianas of the Guianas. In this penultimate episode of Season 6, we'll hear all about the ethnobotany of Amazonian lianas and much more.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team, and your host of Plants of the Gods. Today, we have the honor and pleasure of interviewing one of the world's authorities on lianas, truly one of the plants of the gods, Bruce Hoffman, Dr. Bruce Hoffman, a friend of long standing, and he is going to tell us what lianas are, why they're interesting, why they're important, and cover some of his favorite lianas like ayahuasca. But by way of introduction, let me point out that to most people, lianas and palms represent the most emblematic botanical denizens of the rainforest. When you think of a rainforest, you think of lianas or you think of palms. However, palms are a family of plants, whereas lianas, which are woody vines, are a growth form and consist of members of many different plant families, even including an Amazonian palm. We don't think of palms as woody vines. But ever since Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan swung through the jungle, although it was mostly in the L.A. County Arboretum near Pasadena rather than Africa, lianas have been considered the rainforest plant par excellence. So welcome, Dr. Bruce Hoffman.
Thank you very much.
Now, Bruce spent about 15 years working on a book called Lianas of the Guianas, and so he's extremely well-placed to inform us as to all aspects of liana world. But I'd like him to start out by telling a story about an occurrence of a rainforest vine that saved a man's life, and then explaining the difference between what is a true liana and what is another growth form. Bruce?
Okay, well, this experience took place quite some years ago in Suriname, and a group of us were studying lianas, collecting plants and focusing on lianas in the preparation of this book, Lianas of the Guianas. And we were in a very remote place, very beautiful place, near the Volksberg in Suriname, and walking along a trail. And we had Mark van Roosmalen, Dr. Mark van Roosmalen, a Dutch primatologist, Brazilian now, citizen of Brazil, and Fritz van Troon, who was a Maroon, the descendants of enslaved people that have formed groups in Suriname and are living basically tribal lives in various interior parts of Suriname. And Fritz is quite a remarkable character. I'll get into more about him later. But he knows scientific names and local names, and so he was part of this group, and Mark Plotkin was there with us also. So here we are walking along, and Mark van Roosmalen, this was an area he was very familiar with, did years of research on primates and the fruits that they eat, and wrote a great book called Fruits of the Guianan Flora. And he had been working and doing research and living in the area without shoes for years. So we were saying, are you really going to do this? And he was like, well, this is my my normal way of being here. So we're walking along this trail, and we had looked at gone off into a side trail for a little bit, and then we came back out, and I was behind Mark van Roosmalen, and I noticed he started weaving, and he was looking like he was drunk, and then suddenly he just fell over, screaming in pain, and rolling around the ground, and I had grabbed a suction snake bite kit suction device to try it, thinking it was a snake, and trying to get the poison out of his foot. And he kept rolling, so the thing kept flying off into the air, and I would run back and grab it and put it back on. And we had two indigenous men with us from Kwamlasumutu, the far south of Suriname, also on the trip. And they were observing this, and they were talking to each other, and we had some other people in the group were saying, it's a snake bite, we have to fly him out of here. And these two guys, it was Yalawifa and Kamanya. And they said, no, it's a spider bite, don't worry about it. So don't worry about it, but you have to, it's not a snake bite. He's not going to die immediately. It's something we can take care of. Give us 5 minutes. And they disappeared. In less than 5 minutes, they were back. And they had these roots, basically aerial roots from a viney plant, and dripping with a kind of red liquid. And they put that on the wound, and they said, he's going to be in pain for 4 hours. But he's going to be okay. It's a spider bite. And that's exactly what happened. He was just fine later in the evening.
Yeah, we thought he was going to die, and it was the indigenous people to the rescue with this climbing plant. Now, Bruce, for our listeners, tell us the difference between these climbing plants. What is a true liana and what isn't?
Right. Well, the climbing habit is something that has evolved in many plants, and so there are different ways to climb, different structures from all these different taxonomic groups. And the liana is, which the name is based on a French word, lianer, which also comes from ligament, so it's binding or linking things. But the name, the name's been used in different ways, but basically it's about woody plants that are rooted in the ground and climb up into the canopy. And the degree of woodiness is different across different groups. Then you have vines, which are herbaceous, and those can climb high or low. And then you have shrubs that basically fall over. So, this drives people that are trying to make definitions. It can drive all of us crazy. But the scandent shrubs are another kind, and they can be woody, or they can be get towards herbaceous. And then you have what are called hemiepiphytes. Hemiepiphytes can be tree-like or vine-like. They may root in the ground, climb up, and then lose the connection to the ground. That's one kind of hemiepiphyte. The other kind is it seeds in the canopy and stays there and sends roots down to the ground and makes a connection. So in both cases, they have had a connection to the ground. They may have lost it or maintained it. So with the diversity of the canopy, you have these plants are evolving and making do in the very complex, different layers of canopy, and have different strategies. And the plant that was collected as the medicine is an aroid. It's a philodendron, and it's growing up in the canopy but putting down these roots connected to the ground.
Okay, so Bruce, if I hear you correctly, true lianas are plants that start out as small shrubs on the forest floor and then grow upwards towards the light. Because they climb up over and through the trees, they don't have to expend energy on structural support, like growing a tree, and can focus instead on leaf production, rapid growth, and producing unusual chemicals to deter predation by the myriad vertebrates and invertebrates that inhabit the canopy ecosystem where they thrive. So talk to us a bit about some of these lianas and the interesting chemicals they produce.
Lianas are known by the indigenous peoples I've worked with as to be highly medicinal. And so you have a great variety of applications and kinds of medicine. And so one example would be the Lonchocarpus, which is a fish poison, okay? And that's not that common of a plant where I worked in Suriname, but they are there throughout the forest here and there. And those plants have rotenone, high levels of rotenone. Where I work, it's called ineku, but it's also been called barbasco and in general around in the neotropics. And so that has rotenone and which is a pesticide, insecticide, and a pesticide. So fish are stunned and come to the surface and are easily caught, and they have big rituals around that. It's also commonly used for scabies, head lice, mites, and for fish poisoning. I read about an event in Oregon where the local government used rotenone to kill 200,000 invasive goldfish, saving and only killing 3 trout. So they selectively got rid of these invasive goldfish.
Well, I think that one of the important takeaways from the rotenone example is that plants that have a use in one society may have a very different use in another. Rotenone is used as a fish killer or a fish stunner, really, in the Amazon, but it's one of our most important biodegradable pesticides. But that brings to mind another liana example from the Amazon, and that's curare. So tell us a bit about curare.
Okay, curare is something used by indigenous groups for hundreds or thousands of years, largely for hunting. So there are various curares. Curare is a poison based on alkaloids, and you have your strychnose-related ones, which is strychnine-related alkaloids, and that's also called calabash curare. So these were plants that were discovered by Europeans that were in French Guiana and Suriname Guyana area first, and Makushi were known to have the strongest arrow poisons. And these various explorers, Sir Walter Raleigh, Waterton, Schomburg, Humboldt, all observed these poisons being used and either just described it or did studies with it. And eventually it became useful as a paralyzing agent in anesthesia in Europe. Now, the indigenous people were using them as in admixtures also, and that was in part to increase the bioavailability of the toxin in the blood. So you have plants like piper in the black pepper family and many, many, many kind of cocktails.
Define bioavailability.
Well, if you don't have it, then it's not going to go into the blood and reach all the nervous system and where the actual paralyzing effect happens. And so you also have this calabash curare, you have the tube curare, and curare is from a plant in the Menisperm maceae, Chondrodendron tomentosum, and that one is related to dopamine, and that one is the one that's been used in medicine, although now the other alternatives have been discovered. But this is back in the 1800s.
Okay, well, the question comes to mind, why would these lianas go to all the trouble of producing poisons that would be useful for hunting rainforest mammals? What's the biological or evolutionary rationale behind plants like lianas producing these compounds? What purpose do they serve for the plant?
Well, as you were mentioning, these plants produce a lot of leaf. Compared to trees, the percentage of leaf material is much higher, the percentage of leaf to wood, because they get up to the canopy kind of cheaply. They use a cheap kind of construction, soft wood and large vessels, so they can pipe water easily, and they have a lot of soft materials, and they can also, if they're broken on the way up, they can repair easily. They're not completely rigid. So they get up to the top, and then they start spreading horizontally where they have the chance. And those leaves are something that the insects are very happy about. So they need protection. And so that is one theory about why they produce so many compounds, so many alkaloids, so much medicine, is that they need much more protection, and they're moving into different environments also. So their growing tips are noticeable.
Well, a quick list I put together in preparing for this interview shows that South American Indians have employed lianas as food, arrow poisons, fish poisons, cordage, stimulants, hallucinogens, snuffs, dyes, sources of potable water, coca additives, and to stun bees so that honey could be extracted from their hives. So if lianas are so useful, why do Western scientists like us typically find them so difficult to study in the forest?
Yes, well, these lianas are, their flowers and fruits are in the top of the canopy. So that has made the inaccessibility has kept them out of the eyes of scientists for many years. So, most of the studies, most of the collections of lianas are along the riverside, easy access. And then you have some lianas that are specialized in that sunny area, or they're just falling into that area from, fallen trees. And so you get some of these species, riverine kind of species, and that's basically, a huge percentage of the knowledge is based on that, because flowers and fruits are used to identify these plants to species. So you have also, there's kind of disrespect for lianas coming from foresters, and this whole idea that lianas just kill things. They wrap around, or the strangler fig is another kind of liana-like plant that's just killing things. And foresters don't like, their product to be damaged. So a lot of work in forestry involves cutting the lianas off. Also, lianas attach themselves to other trees and pull other trees down. So I think that's a part of it too. People have had a negative attitude towards lianas as being a hassle and having no benefits.
Well, in prepping for our chat today, I checked the all-important ChatGPT to see what sort of medicinal potential lianas had. And according to ChatGPT, lianas have antimicrobial, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, analgesic, anti-cancer, neuroprotective, cardiovascular, and antiviral properties. Now, this type of information needs to be checked. But my question to you is, you having lived for years in the jungles of Guyana and Suriname, how important are these lianas in the ethnopharmacopoeia, that is, in the medicine cabinet of these Amerindian and the Maroon peoples?
Okay, with the people I worked with, we'll start with the indigenous, the trios, and the Wayana, some other groups. And I've seen this in my research and also in your research, Mark, that at least 1/3 of the pharmacopoeia is from liana species. And the others are a mix of things, but, trees and herbs and some of the house medicine around the kitchen medicine, or things that grow around the huts. And for the Maroons, it's a much higher percentage of the women herbalists are using their medicine from close by, and much less of the lianas. And there are some notable similarities. There's a genus Bauhinia, very common, notable ribbon-like liana everywhere in the neotropics. And the Maroons use that as a bone healing medicine. They take it and break it down and apply it to wounds and bones. And in the trios, it was their top diarrhea medicine. And they boil it down and you drink the liquid along with some other plants. So you have those two different ways of using it. I would say, in my experience, you might say 30%, 1/3 or so is of the known medicines for the trios come from lianas, but I found that many of the most important medicines that they use are lianas. So you might say you have 100 plants are used as medicine, but the lianas are the most important ones that are used over and over again and used in mixtures. Oh, I saw that repeatedly, and there was I was down in Kwamala and in Suriname during the COVID pandemic, and it was fascinating and inspiring that there was this resurgence of interest in their traditional medicine by the villagers that are not, they may be going to the church and they don't see the shamans as being super valuable, some of them. And there was this resurgence and renaissance of interest in these medicines, and they started to ask, well, what's going in them and how can we learn to make it? And it kind of went into high production because they were also frightened of the vaccine. So they were using their own medicines, as their protection. And they were mostly lianas. I can't say what was in them, but they were high percentage of lianas were going into those medicines.
So my takeaway from your answer is that lianas are very important medicinally, very undervalued as medicines by outsiders, scientists, and very understudied by outsiders, botanists and ethnobotanists and what have you. So give a little info on the Katamwima liana as an example of what remains out there to be learned.
Okay, well, the Katamwima liana is a croton species, and it's it's specialized, let's say it's limited distribution. So if you're saying it's down in that area, you'll think it's everywhere because it's quite abundant locally, but you don't see it in other places that much, and it's not out of the Guyanas, and that's one of the top medicines, as are many crotons in different parts of the neotropics and the world. But it's important in, say, one of the uses is leishmaniasis. So it's part of a leishmaniasis treatment, and leishmaniasis is one of the worst things you can get and one of the worst things you can try to have cured in Western medicine. It's heavy metals and weeks of taking this stuff, and you don't know if it's going to kill you. Which one's going to kill you, right? And it's injected, yeah. And so the trios have a recipe that involves some various plants, but this croton liana is one of them, and it's put topically on. So for that kind of leishmaniasis, that's cutaneous, then it's a very effective cure. And we had also brought a shaman, Amashina, to see the maroons, and that was quite exciting because they had no idea. The plant was growing all over the place around the village, and they were very excited to learn and to be shown. He wasn't keeping it secret. In this case, he was showing them to help the community because many, especially it seemed young girls, had these leishmaniasis sores on their shins and upper legs. So that was a very inspiring, exciting moment to see him share it. And then some of the women that we were working with in the village said, "Hey, don't tell anyone else in the village about this." Which is quite silly.
So how much leishmaniasis was there in the village when you and Amashina first arrived, and how much was there when you departed?
Well, it takes a while to cure, but I came back a few years, and they said it was really minimized from that original. I think it was people working in the fields that were getting these phlebotomid flies, these white flies. Sandflies.
Yeah, one of the criticisms of ethnobotany is when you hear about things like this or you see cases like this, people say, well, that's just one case. Maybe it was a placebo effect. That's not science. And my response is always the same. It is science. Science begins with N=1. You see something, one case, and you extrapolate from there. So the idea that, well, we haven't done this in double-blind trials for thousands and thousands of cases is true. But it doesn't mean that one shaman in one village treating one disease with a couple of plants is not effective. It needs to be taken to the next level. So I guess the most famous liana of all in the Amazon right now, something which started out as an obscure liana in the northwest Amazon and is now being taken probably every day of the year from Israel to India to Indonesia, is ayahuasca. That is probably become the most famous rainforest liana. So talk a little bit about that vine.
Sure. So, ayahuasca was, has gone through a renaissance, right? It's ayahuasca sessions and kind of a new age movement, and you have, it's been part of in South America for years and years. Ayahuasca produces these alkaloids, and it's been used in rituals, and it's linked with telepathy. Many books such as Wizard of the Upper Amazon, which was Bruce Lamb transcribing.
The Cosmic Serpent by Jeremy Narby is a classic.
Yeah. Amazon Beaming is another one. So there's a lot of books that kind of describe the ritual and the tradition for groups of people in these villages. And it's also used in prophecy, divination, very important native mythology. And one of the early botanists in the Amazon, Richard Spruce, was one of the first ones to collect it and drink the potion. And he also gave the name Banisteria capi, back then Banisteria instead of Banisteriopsis. It's also a plant like Hirari that has many admixtures, and wherever you go in Northwest Amazon where people are practicing it, they're going to have different cocktails, basically. There are at least 100 species known to be added, and from 40 different plant families in the ayahuasca. And then you have the plants that need to be combined. So there are these admixtures. There are, many admixtures, but there's one essential one is Chacruna, Psychotria viridis, and there's another one that is used sometimes as a replacement or in combination, the Okoyahe Diplopterus caberana, and that one is also in the same family as Yahe, Banisteriopsis. So these are both the Malpighiaceae family, and so there are tryptamines in those plants. And what those do is they are necessary as monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So without those two plants, or one of those plants, then the effects won't be as strong. And that's where, it's just interesting that they have, all across Northwest Amazon, they have found the way to combine these plants. So you have those basic pairs always with Banisteriopsis, always with the Yahe, and then you have your 100 species of different admixtures that will be having a different effect.
Which brings up another question. How, in your opinion, do these shamans find these plants or find these combinations of plants, like your friend Amashina? I've asked him that many times, but I'd like to get your take, your opinion, your thoughts on how these incredible healers are finding these plants in a forest of tens of thousands of species.
Well, I think definitely that some of them are using some kind of divination. I mean, they are having visions. They are being guided. They will say that for sure. And it's just too, it's hard to imagine that not happening. I have, no proof, but it's hard to imagine that not happening when you're walking in the rainforest. You see how many plants there are and how many, centuries would it take to figure out that this one little plant has to go with that one. So, there is a lot of experimentation. So, shamans are scientists. They're experimenting all the time. And they will try something for a while. With Amashina, you'd say, well, this one is good, but this is a 2-week cure, while this one's a 2-day cure. And often he was talking about a tree versus a liana that was the more effective one. But he would, say, if you're in the forest and you're desperate, you're going to take this one because it's still going to cure you, even if it's going to take 2 weeks. And one of the most exciting moments for me in the Amazon was when Amashina went to the Maroon village, Stonehuku, and was sharing all this knowledge with a healer there, and then later bringing that healer to Amashina's village. And these guys are just walking and talking and nonstop, and they were, maybe because they came from different areas, they didn't seem competitive. They seemed like they were just taking the joy of sharing what they know and how they see things. So that's that openness, there were probably definitely in the past, there were a lot more people traveling from different villages, and they would meet and have these big kind of fish-catching festivals with the Barbasco also, and marriage, and they have these sharing and interaction and even intermarriage. So that was going on a lot more in the past. So I think it's a combination of these having visions, which you can read about in many of these books, very powerful visions that can be navigational tools in life and can guide you to a plant that you need to find. And at the same time, they're keeping their eyes open and trying all kinds of different things and being creative.
Well, I worked on a film, an IMAX film in the Amazon, and finishing up the last day of shooting, the director turned to me and said, "Look at these people. There's geniuses among them, but they've never had the opportunities that you and I have had as Westerners. And what a shame that we don't recognize and celebrate these geniuses. So I'd like to use that as a lead-in to celebrate two of these geniuses that you and I have both had the honor and privilege of working with. One is Amashina of the Trios, and the other is Fritz von Troen of the Saramacaners. So pull back the lens a little bit from just Lianas and talk about Amashina as a person and a healer, and then do the same for Fritz, which takes us right back to your book, The Lianas of the Guianas."
Okay. The first time I met Amashina, he was in a breechcloth, and that was not a show. He was, in those years in the 90s, he was wearing a breechcloth, and Mark, of course, had met him long before that. But he has let's say, a resilience and kind of, he's very energetic, and you see him from charismatic. Say he's very charismatic. He's wearing fancy clothes. That's something kind of interesting about him. He's always very well dressed and very conscious of it, and he has he's got a mystical way about him. So I would say he's a trickster. I think that describes him well, trickster. And so you don't really know what's everything that's up with him, right? And I've worked with him for years, actually. We walked through forest plots. I set out hectare plots with the Trios and with the Saramacaners in similar forest types, and that was my dissertation work. So we would go every day out to some plot and walk through methodically, looking at every single plant. So I learned a lot from him about how you have these different times of it, that almost everything is a medicine. Like maybe 3% had no use, and he had I would compare, cross-check, and he was very consistent. So I'm very impressed with his knowledge and his kind of way of getting through in the world. Other people in the village did not appreciate him. He did not go to church. He put his family house kind of compound a mile away from everybody else, as to do some of the other shaman. And if you go out there, you're in his little world.
Let's go to Fritz. Tell us about the great Fritz von Troen, who's been a mentor to you and me both.
Okay, Fritz von Troen is, as I mentioned earlier, he's a Saramacan, a Maroon that is part of the descendants of enslaved people. And he was a very special, unique individual in that he grew up in a village that was in the interior of Suriname. It was flooded eventually to create a reservoir, and everybody had to leave, and all the maybe 13 villages were displaced, and the people had to go live on the shore in not the nicest area, and are still there now. And he got it in his head to work in forestry. So he was working with cutting down trees and everything, and becoming a tree spotter, a knowledgeable person about trees. And he met another scientist there and some other scientists from Holland and various people, and really started to grab on tenaciously to scientific names And so he learned Latin names for all of these plants. And he was noticed by some some scientists that were visiting, and he had his own, he's a stubborn person, and he's had his own way of learning, but he never stopped. And so he has and is now an iconic person in Suriname. He's one of the better known people, and he's also an avid conservationist, always speaking out about protecting the rainforest. But he's also one of the only people that knows trio language, indigenous knowledge for the plants, the uses and the names, and Saramaccan knowledge and Latin names for plants. So I was honored to work with him in that Liana research we started doing, and he was the initial inspiration to even have a Liana book. Oh, he would never stop talking about Lianas, and he realized that they were quite understudied and ignored, and I think because he had so much time in the forest, he had special abilities to really look at lianas and the bark and the sap and everything about them along with the trees. So he had this phenomenal encyclopedic knowledge, and we would go on the Liana project, and he would talk about the ecology, what birds were having nests up there, in the canopy, and he also took great delight in looking at all of these, being in nature and sharing with people. So that's why he's such an interesting figure, and he has been up until recently, very active. He's getting old now, and he's not in the forest as much.
Well, it's very popular these days to have these apps on your cell phones where you can look at a plant and identify it. And to those of us who've had the opportunity to work with Fritz, that's old hat, because you can walk through the Amazon rainforest and say, "Hey, Fritz, what's this?" He'll tell you the name, the Latin name, that is the scientific name. He'll tell you the Dutch name. He'll then often tell you the English name. He'll tell you the trio name, the Amerindian name. He'll sometimes know the Portuguese name. Then he'll tell you when it flowers and fruits, what pollinates it, and what it's good for. And there's no app yet that can keep up with Fritz. I spent 10 years in the Ivy League, and I don't think I've ever called anybody I met there a genius. Fritz is a certifiable genius. And, when you work with a guide, guides tend to specialize in something. A guide is a specialist in mammals or a specialist in birds. Everybody who's done a biology PhD in Suriname from outside that I'm aware of, Russ Mittermeier, Mark van Roosmalen, Bruce Hoffman, had Fritz as a guide. And when I say guide, that's really not an accurate term, because mentor, teacher, first aid provider, and everything else. So those of us who have had the great fortune to have lived and worked with Fritz in the Amazon are very fortunate, and we'll never forget him. So as we wind down, Bruce, I want you to talk about climate change in lianas, what we've been able to learn to looking at changes in forest composition, changes in lianas size that indicate that climate change is real and really happening.
Yes, well, lianas, there's been a number of studies. Dr. Steven Schnitzner is one of the main people working on that has published on this one. Of course, there are others. But the main idea is that the lianas, they are, as climate changes, they are advantaged. They can survive. They're more adaptable, and they sequester less carbon. They have softer wood. They have large vessels, and that means less carbon as in some areas they're starting to dominate more and more. And the number of species that are present in a place and the number of stems and the size is increasing. One of these studies was in Barra Colorado Island in Panama. So, it's not that the whole Amazon has been sampled for this, but the issue is that the lianas are increasing in their dominance, and that is going to have some impact on how much carbon will be sequestered by the forest.
Well, again, this gets to the point that conservation in biology is not just about finding new and useful medicines, that there are lessons these species of plants and animals can teach us about everything from pollution to climate change to the basic functioning of the forest ecosystem. And that's why it's so urgent not only to study these organisms, both plants and animals and fungi, but to protect them. Because as they say in Suriname, since we've talked so much about Suriname this afternoon, is that the rainforest holds answers to questions we have yet to ask. And the fact that you're able to document that indigenous peoples were able to use lianas as medicines during COVID indicates that there's potential there that should be documented. And if the Indians are willing to teach it to us, if the Maroons are willing to teach it to us, that decision should be up to them. They may be valuable lessons for treating the next pandemic. But once again, it's protecting the species and the knowledge of how to use them. And again, I want to emphasize something that you pointed out, which is that the shamanic knowledge is not static. It's not something they learned about and stopped learning after 1491. They're still learning. And it's imperative for all of us who have an interest in these forests, in these rivers, in these oceans, in these ice caps, to find a better way to develop better stewardship and to empower the indigenous peoples who are the best stewards of these ecosystems that Bruce was discussing. And when I say indigenous peoples, I mean that in the broad sense. That means the first Americans, native peoples, the Indians, the Amerindians. They're called different things in different countries. The Maroons, the Afro-Americans of the rainforest. Black lives certainly matter, but we need to focus on the black lives in the Amazon as well. And also a similar shout-out to peasant peoples in the Amazon, particularly the caboclos of the Brazilian Amazon, who have an in-depth knowledge of these forests and how to use them. So the challenge is before us, and I think that books like the Lianas of the Lianas, which is the pioneering work that Bruce did, are a valuable contribution towards that effort. And I want to point out that not only is this a brilliant biological tome, but it was designed by Nancy Valise, a graphic designer, who turned this into a work of art. So I'm hoping that people who are interested in lianas and learning more and seeing them in person don't have to slog through the mud and the heat and the mosquitoes like Bruce did for 15 years, but can find and buy a copy of the book. It's a great coffee table book and a great reference book at the same time. So I want to thank Dr. Hoffman. Perhaps we have to have him on again because there's so many stories to tell about lianas, and there's so little that's known about them. And for a non-Indigenous person, I think Bruce knows about as much as any scientist I'm aware of. So thank you, Dr. Hoffman.
I had a story I wanted to tell. It's a story about sustainability, and it's a trio myth, and it's pertinent to our Liana Day here. So the story is called Ineku Boy. Ineku is another name for Lonchocarpus, the fish poison liana that we spoke about earlier. So Ineku was a little, maybe a 4-year-old boy, 5-year-old boy, and he would go swimming every day. And, of course, all the trios go swimming every day. And so he'd go down to the water, and people would notice that fish were floating up and were very easy to catch just when he would touch the water. And so word got around, like, this little boy is miraculous. I mean, he's helping us fish. And so people started, saying, hey, would you go swimming with me today? And his parents were getting a little upset because, the whole village was coming and, like, taking him here, taking him there. And it became quite a nightmare for them because everybody wanted their little boy. And then at some point, they just basically, he died because he was torn apart. And he was just disappeared in the water. And so he was eventually, the spirit took him and placed his bones. His mother, with the spirit, took him and placed his bones in different places around, far off in the forest, so people would not find him. And so the story is that kind of lack of sharing and demand for the resource and abuse of the resource is why the fish vine is so hard to find in these days.
We often find that these indigenous stories, myths, legends, whatever you want to call them, sometimes have a basis in reality or are told to teach a lesson. I remember the Amazon Conservation Team was doing a mapping exercise in the Xingu in the southeast Amazon, and the shaman said, okay, in this part of the river, the headwaters of the river, is the two-headed black invisible jaguar. And I said, well, have you ever seen him? He goes, no, he's invisible. But what I later realized that you couldn't go to the headwaters because that's where the two-headed black invisible jaguar lived, which is a way of keeping people out of the headwaters, which is a way of protecting everything downstream. So when you hear these legends, instead of dismissing them, it's always worth pondering what it really means. And I think your wonderful example of the Ineku boy is one very good example of that.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to check out other episodes. From ayahuasca to magic mushrooms, from the ethnobotany of warfare to the history and prehistory of wine. Please give us a top rating and subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our final episode of Season 5, join us as our host, Dr. Mark Plotkin, talks about mushrooms, which are truly having a moment.